Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. May 1974, Mazatlán, Mexico. The streets shimmered under a punishing sun, brilliant, restless, alive, and dangerous. In that heat, Oscar Zeta Acosta, attorney, activist, author, the self-proclaimed Brown Buffalo, was once again standing on the edge of law, the edge of identity, the edge of myth. He called his teenage son. On the line, his voice carried an electric unease. "I'm about to board a boat full of white snow," he said. Cocaine? Code for something? A warning only he understood? Well, it was the last time anyone ever heard from him. And then nothing. No body, no answers, just silence that stretched into legend. He was a radical lawyer who defended the East LA 13, a political firebrand who ran for sheriff on a promise to tear down the system. A friend wild enough to inspire Hunter S. Thompson's Dr. Gonzo. All this and then gone. Murdered by cartels, silenced by politics, or a man who staged his own escape into myth. This is the disappearance that became legend. This is the mystery that refuses to die. This is the story of Oscar Zeta Acosta. Let's transport ourselves to the time and place. Close your eyes and imagine Los Angeles in the 1960s. The sidewalks of East LA teem with brown-skinned youth in zoot suits, cruising Whittier Boulevard beneath the sun. And these aren't just fashion statements. They're proud defiance. The zoot suit riots of the 1940s still echo in the air. Protests against marginalized youth who dared to claim presence, style, and identity. By the time Oscar came of age, the defiance had matured into the Chicano movement, a cultural and political uprising. High school students, fed up with decrepit classrooms and a curriculum that erased their heritage, organized what would become the legendary 1968 East LA walkouts. Thousands of young Mexicans and Chicanos marched out of their schools, demanding representation. And they changed the narrative of American civil rights. And in the shadows of those walkouts, organizations like La Raza magazine chronicled brutality, neglect, and resistance in real time. In the streets and in printed ink, a movement took shape. One that saw Oscar stepping forward as both lawyer and voice, defending the students and standing up to a system built to keep them silent. Westward to San Francisco, the city simmered with its own contradictions. It pulsed with counterculture, poetry, and protests. Yet even there, Hispanics wrestled against marginalization, not in barrios, but in the classrooms of colleges where they were hardly seen. Oscar, studying creative writing and pushing for a voice that united West Coast dreamers with the pain and promise of the barrio, carried the same revolutionary energy wherever he went. Across the border to Mexico in the early 70s, Mazatlán and rural Sinaloa shimmered with heat and possibility. Americans flocked to its shores, sun-baked and naive, escaping the upheavals of their own country. But in that rising tide of tourism, darker undercurrents churned. Corruption, silence, and a parallel world where power operated with no witnesses. Oscar's life threaded through all of it. The East LA schools where he championed bilingual education, the San Francisco Cafe where he drafted poems and fought depression, the cantinas of Mazatlán where he vanished. His story isn't just about an individual. It's the geography of struggle. LA's fight for recognition, San Francisco's duality of freedom and exclusion, Mexico's collision of tourist illusion and off-the-books peril. And to tourists back then, to wander those streets in the 60s and 70s would have meant stepping into zones of tension. In Los Angeles, you might see students marching or walls covered in murals, symbols of pride and rebellion. In San Francisco, the idealism of the Summer of Love masked a city still rife with waiting prejudice. In Mazatlán, the postcard sunsets hid swells of risk. And within that storm of change, Los Angeles rising in protest, San Francisco buzzing with counterculture, Mexico shimmering with both escape and danger, stood one man who seemed to embody it all. A preacher turned lawyer, a writer turned revolutionary, a father, a fighter, a dreamer, and a destroyer. To understand Oscar Zeta Acosta's disappearance, we first have to understand the man himself. His beginnings, his battles, his contradictions. Because before he became the mythic brown buffalo, he was simply Oscar, born into a family of immigrants, restless from the start, always searching for where he belonged. So let's go back to El Paso, Texas, 1935, where the story of Oscar truly begins. Oscar Zeta Acosta's life began on April 8, 1935, in El Paso, Texas. He was born to Manuel and Juanita Acosta, his father from Mexico, his mother from El Paso. He was the third child in a family that would eventually number 6. Though loss touched them early, one of Oscar's siblings died young. His older brother, Roberto, born just a year before him in 1934, would grow up to be his closest companion. And when Oscar was 5 years old, the Acosta family packed their belongings and moved west, settling in California's San Joaquin Valley, in a small town near Modesto called Riverbank. Life was not easy there. Manuel and Juanita took jobs picking peaches under the relentless sun. Then World War II came. Manuel enlisted in the Navy, leaving Juanita to raise the children largely on her own. She found work in a tomato paste cannery. It was around then she started going by the name Jenny, urging her children to pass, to blend in, to smooth away the edges of their Mexican heritage. One of Oscar's sisters later put it starkly to a journalist. Short of bathing in Clorox, everything was white-oriented. Assimilate, 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 or you'll be nothing. And so, Oscar grew up straddling 2 worlds. In high school, he was charismatic, athletic, and popular. He played football, dated a well-liked white classmate, and even became junior class president. He played the clarinet and earned a music scholarship to USC, though he never attended. Instead, after graduation, relentless and searching, he joined the U.S. Air Force. It was there, stationed in Panama, that Oscar went through his first great transformation. He found religion, or at least it seemed so. He became a Baptist missionary, what he half-jokingly called a Mexican Billy Graham, preaching fiery sermons at a leprosy settlement. But inside, doubt gnawed at him. He began to question the very faith he was proclaiming. He even wrote what he called a letter of resignation to Jesus. He would keep preaching for a while, even though he no longer believed. Later, he admitted, that really affected my whole thing, with the result that, when I got out of the service, I attempted suicide. His return to civilian life was turbulent. He enrolled at Modesto Junior College, later transferring to San Francisco State University to study creative writing. By day, he supported himself as a copyboy for the San Francisco Examiner. By night, he scribbled poems, short stories, and even a novel. An interwoven Romeo and Juliet tale of Okies and Chicanos in the valley. Publishers rejected it. Now, around this time, Oscar's personal life was no less dramatic. In 1956, After a suicide attempt landed him in a Modesto hospital, he met Betty Daves, a white woman from the Midwest who worked there as an occupational therapist. They married soon after and had a son, Marco. But the marriage faltered, torn apart by Oscar's inner turmoil, mood swings, and bouts of depression. By 1963, it ended in divorce. His 20s were restless, manic, punctuated by breakdowns and battles with obesity and ulcers that plagued him throughout his life. Yet he pressed forward, becoming the first in his family to earn a college degree. Nights found him in law school classrooms at San Francisco Law School, and by 1966 he had passed the California bar exam on the second try. In 1967, Oscar was working with the East Oakland Legal Aid Society as an anti-poverty attorney. And that summer, fate threw him together with a young journalist named Hunter S. Thompson. It would prove to be one of the most volatile, creative, and ultimately destructive friendships of his life. It was also around this time that Oscar reinvented himself once more. He dropped his given middle name and adopted a new one, Zeta, inspired by a Mexican revolutionary general from the 1959 film La Cucaracha. It was either that or Zorro. Nobody really knows for sure. But the fire inside him was not so easily contained. In early 1968, he was arrested after a drunken bar fight in Juarez, Mexico. The Mexican judge refused to believe Oscar was either a lawyer or an American citizen. And days later, when he tried to cross back into the U.S. border, guards waved him off, insisting he was Mexican, not American. The moment etched itself into his identity. A man who belonged in both worlds and neither. By late 1968, he had moved to East Los Angeles, plunging headlong into the Chicano movement. There, he became the movement's fiery lawyer, representing students, activists, and radicals. He defended the Chicano 13, accused of conspiracy for their role in the East LA school walkouts, where some 20,000 students protested educational inequality. He defended the Biltmore Six, accused of setting fires during a Ronald Reagan appearance. He stood beside the Brown Berets, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, and countless barrio residents facing police harassment. The LAPD didn't take kindly to his work. They trailed him, harassed him, yet Oscar embraced his defiance. He carried a flowered attaché case, plastered with a Chicano power sticker. He wore loud ties, showed up to court barefoot, sometimes armed with a pistol, sometimes high on acid. His business cards bore the image of the Aztec god of war. In 1969, he married Socorro Aguinaga. A year later, he ran for Los Angeles County Sheriff against the powerful incumbent, Peter J. Pitchess. Oscar's platform? To abolish the sheriff's department as it existed. And he received over 100,000 votes, beating one of Pitch's rivals, but losing the election by a wide margin. By 1971, his marriage to Socorro had ended. He closed his law practice and retreated to the Bay Area to write, drinking and using drugs to fuel his creativity. Meanwhile, his friendship with Hunter S. Thompson was imploding. Hunter had immortalized Oscar, thinly disguised as a 300-pound Samoan named Dr. Gonzo, in his Rolling Stone articles and later in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. At first, Oscar resisted signing off on the book's publication, feeling Hunter had distorted him, stolen his soul. Eventually, he relented, in exchange for his photo and name on the dust jacket. But the damage was done. Their friendship never recovered. So Oscar poured his voice into his own books. In 1972, he published Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo, a blistering, surreal account of a man battling for identity in a racist America. In 1973 came The Revolt of the Cockroach People, a fictionalized chronicle of the Chicano moratorium and the killing of the journalist Ruben Salazar. In both works, he cast himself as a mythic figure, Zeta, the brown buffalo, the cockroach revolutionary. But his body was breaking down. By January 1974, his ulcers grew so severe he checked himself into a San Francisco clinic. From there, he wrote letters to his son Marco, telling him of his next plan. He would head to Mexico to work on a new book. He said he had first considered Mexico City, but his plans had changed. Instead, he was going to Mazatlán. Now, he hinted he would be making a great deal of money there. And with that, Oscar Zeta Acosta, lawyer, activist, writer, firebrand, left the United States for Mexico. But he would never return. By the spring of 1974, Oscar was fading from the public stage. His fiery court defenses, his radical campaigns, his larger-than-life battles with the system, all of it seemed to be giving way to something quieter, more erratic, and more dangerous. From a clinic bed in San Francisco, recovering from a brutal ulcer flare-up, he had written to his teenage son Marco with promises and hints of a new chapter. He told him he planned to go to Mexico. First, Mexico City, then suddenly changing course to Mazatlán on the Pacific coast. He said he was working on a new book. He also suggested with a cryptic bravado that he expected to make a lot of money. On the evening of May 15th, 1974, 14-year-old Marco was at home in San Francisco. He and his mother had just finished dinner when the phone rang. His mother, Betty, stepped out for a walk with the dog, so Marco picked up. He never knew for certain where his father would be calling him from, or what state of mind he'd be in. That night, Oscar's voice came across the crackling line, lively but hurried. They made some small talk. Marco promised to keep his grades above a B average. Oscar promised he would behave and that he'd be home soon. For a moment, it sounded like a simple exchange between a father and son. Then, as quickly as it began, the conversation tilted. Oscar cut the call short. "I have to go. I'm boarding a boat full of white snow." Marco rolled his eyes. He knew exactly what his father meant. Oscar's appetite for cocaine, and nearly every other drug he could lay his hands on, was legendary. Marco told him he loved him. Then he hung up the phone. And that was the last time anyone ever heard from Oscar. Days passed, then months, and still no word. By the fall of 1974, the family's unease hardened into dread. They launched a desperate search, enlisting the help of the Coast Guard, the FBI, and even the Salvation Army. Some family members traveled to Mazatlán themselves, chasing whispers, searching records, and combing through morgues. They checked every John Doe case they could find, but none matched. Locals knew him. His presence in Mazatlán had not gone unnoticed. Yet no one could say where he had gone. His body was never found. Outside of his family, the search for Oscar dwindled almost before it began. Authorities in Mexico had little incentive to pursue the case. In the U.S., most simply assumed he was dead. His old friend, Hunter S. Thompson, wrestled with it for years. He hired a private detective, collected rumors, and only in 1977 did he finally memorialize Oscar in print. The essay, published in Rolling Stone under the title "The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat," was equal parts obituary, elegy, and insult. In it, Hunter described Oscar as a stupid, vicious quack with no morals at all and the soul of a hammerhead shark. To most, it sounded cruel. But to those who knew Hunter, it was his way of showing love, rage, and affection, all tangled together. He admitted that Oscar was a powerful attorney and a voice for the movement, but he was also a man who had surrendered to amphetamines, LSD, and chaos. Time passed. The brown buffalo's myth only grew. Officially, Oscar Zeta Acosta remained missing until December 1986, when he was declared legally dead in absentia. And we're left with the question that has haunted his story for 50 years. What really happened to Oscar? Now, theories abound, but none are proven. But each tells us something about the man and the myth of the brown buffalo. In the absence of answers, theories rush in to fill the silence. And when it comes to Oscar Zeta Acosta, the theories are as chaotic and combustible as the man himself. His son Marco has never wavered in his belief. Oscar was killed by drug traffickers. And to Marco, the clues were plain. His father wasn't just a user of cocaine and amphetamines. He dealt them when he was strapped for cash. Oscar's own words on the night of May 15th, "I'm boarding a boat full of white snow," sounded less like poetry and more like the prelude to a smuggling run. Marco is convinced his father was murdered in a deal gone bad, a shootout with drug lords somewhere off the coast of Sinaloa. He later told interviewers, "The body was never found, but we surmise that, probably, knowing the people he was involved with, he ended up mouthing off, getting into a fight, and getting killed." It's a grim but plausible end for a man who lived on the edge of danger, equal parts lawyer and outlaw. But another theory suggests a darker hand at play: political assassination. Oscar's old friend, Hunter S. Thompson, gave voice to this suspicion. In his 1977 Rolling Stone article, "The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat," Hunter speculated that Oscar was either murdered by drug dealers or eliminated for political reasons. He even claimed that Oscar had been running drugs near Coconut Grove in Miami, a revelation that blurred the lines between conspiracy and confession. And then there were the files. It's now well documented that both the FBI and the LAPD tracked Oscar under the notorious COUNTELPRO program, a covert federal operation designed to surveil, infiltrate, and neutralize activists deemed subversive. Oscar's work in East Los Angeles, defending the Brown Berets, championing the Chicano moratorium, railing against systemic injustice, had made him a target. His sister and his ex-wife would later say outright that they believed he was disappeared by forces opposed to his revolutionary activities. Could the U.S. government have taken him out during that fateful trip to Mexico? It wouldn't have been the first time the government targeted prominent voices of resistance. Leaders of the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, anti-war organizers, all were monitored, some neutralized. Is it really so far-fetched that a radical Chicano lawyer who openly spoke of dismantling the system might have been marked for elimination? But maybe the truth doesn't lie in some elaborate conspiracy or violent showdown. Maybe Oscar's disappearance has a simpler, more human explanation. Oscar was no stranger to excess. His appetite for drugs was legendary. LSD, amphetamines, cocaine, barbiturates, often consumed in alarming quantities. Friends and family alike knew that his substance use was both a fuel and a curse. It drove his manic bursts of energy, his booming courtroom bravado, his fearless political fire. But it also hollowed him out, left him unpredictable, erratic, vulnerable, leading some to speculate that his end came not by bullet or government plot, but by his own body giving out. Perhaps in Mazatlán, under the weight of too much cocaine, too much amphetamine, too much of everything, Oscar suffered a fatal overdose. Or maybe it was a drug-induced heart attack, his system finally collapsing after years of abuse. Now, if that were the case, it's not hard to imagine his companions, whoever they might have been that night, quickly disposing of his body before it could be identified. In a city like Mazatlán in the 1970s, where the drug trade thrived in shadows and silence, a body could easily vanish without a trace. There's also the theory that Oscar's restless mind itself may have unraveled. He'd spoken before of paranoia, of feeling hunted, of the walls closing in. Some suggest he may have suffered a complete nervous breakdown during his trip, a spiral so deep that it ended in tragedy. And then there's the boat. Marco remembered his father's words that evening, words tinged with both humor and menace. And if that boat existed, and if Oscar truly boarded it that night, what if something simpler happened? What if a storm rolled in, as storms often do on the Pacific coast, and the boat went down? A wreck swallowed by the sea, its passengers lost to the waves. No violence, no conspiracy, just the ocean claiming another life. The simplicity of these theories is haunting in its own way. No shootout, no assassination, no faked death. But then, there's the most tantalizing theory of them all. What if Oscar didn't die in Mazatlán at all? What if the brown buffalo staged his own disappearance, slipping the noose of his chaotic life and walking away into a new one? It's not so far-fetched. By 1974, Oscar's world was unraveling. He was broke, he was single, his health was failing. And his reputation, once that of a fiery civil rights attorney, was drowning beneath stories of brawls, drug binges, and wild paranoia. He had enemies in the courts, in the streets, in the government. Even his closest friends admitted he was running out of road. So maybe he chose the only exit left: reinvention. Hunter Thompson himself toyed with the idea, because after Rolling Stone relocated its offices to New York in 1977, strange hospital bills began arriving at the magazine. Bills issued under the name Oscar Zeta Acosta. Now, no one could explain where they came from or why. They seemed to hint that Oscar might still be alive, or that someone wanted people to think he was. To some, it was a clue, proof that Oscar had ghosted his old life and resurfaced somewhere else. And his family considered the possibility too. His sister once admitted that Oscar had talked about disappearing, about leaving everything behind. She wondered if he might have crossed into Central America or even further, reinventing himself far from the spotlight, far from the FBI, far from the endless cycle of drugs and danger. And in a way, doesn't that sound exactly like something Oscar would do? A man who once declared himself the brown buffalo, larger than life, too wild to be caged by courts or conventions, just vanishing into myth, outsmarting the government, the cartels, and even his own demons. If true, it would be the perfect ending. The loudest man in the room walked out without a sound. But if Oscar did escape into another life, he took his secret to the grave. No sightings, no letters, no whispers of where he might have gone. Only a vanishing act so complete that half a century later, we're still left wondering, did Oscar die in Mexico? Or did he finally get the last word and become his own ghost story? In the end, every theory about Oscar's disappearance says as much about the man as it does about the mystery itself. Was he cut down by drug traffickers, silenced by political enemies, undone by his own excesses, or clever enough to stage his own vanishing act? All these years later, no one can say for sure. What we do know is that Mexico, for all its beauty and vibrancy, has always carried risks for outsiders who find themselves in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong people. Oscar's story, whatever the truth, remains a cautionary tale. When Oscar disappeared in Mazatlán in 1974, Mexico was a different world. The war on drugs had barely begun, and cartel power was only starting to take root. Tourism was growing, but Mazatlán was still a raw port city where visitors could disappear into the back streets, the cantinas, the fishing boats, and sometimes never be seen again. Back then, the rules were different. Border checks were lax, law enforcement was unpredictable, and corruption was everywhere. If you got in trouble in Mexico in the 70s, you were largely on your own. There was no U.S. embassy nearby, no tourist police on patrol, no digital footprint to trace where you'd been. For someone like Oscar, a man who mixed politics, drugs, and defiance, Mexico was both a refuge and a powder keg. Fast forward to today, and Mazatlán paints a far more complex picture. On the surface, it's a thriving resort town. Cruise ships dock weekly. Families stroll the Malecon along the oceanfront. The historic center buzzes with music, open-air cafes, and colonial charm. The Golden Zone gleams with beachside hotels, restaurants, and lights that stay on until dawn. For most visitors, Mazatlán is as safe as any seaside escape. But the shadow of risk hasn't vanished. It simply changed shape. Cartels still operate in the state of Sinaloa, though violence rarely touches tourists directly. Instead, the dangers today are quieter, more insidious. Petty theft, scams, the occasional violent robbery when travelers stray too far from the safe zones. Now, unlike 1974, Mazatlán now has tourist police, surveillance, and designated safe areas where security is tight. The government knows tourism is lifeblood, and they protect it. Still, Oscar's story lingers as a warning. Because while most who visit Mazatlán return home with nothing more than sunburns and souvenirs, the wrong choices, the wrong crowd, the wrong deal, the wrong street, the wrong time can still carry consequences. Drugs, in particular, remain a line you do not cross. The same rule that may have saved Oscar then is the one that still applies now. Stay clear of the trade, and you'll likely stay clear of trouble. So, in many ways, Mazatlán in 2025 is safer, brighter, more tourist-friendly than the Mazatlán of 1974. But underneath the music and the sunshine, there is still an undercurrent. A reminder that this place is a place of contrast, where paradise and peril have always lived side by side. Oscar Zeta Acosta was a man of contradictions. Brilliant and reckless, a fighter and a dreamer. A man who burned so brightly he was almost destined to vanish. And yet his disappearance still feels like a wound, as if the world simply accepted that one day the brown buffalo would walk off stage without a trace. Too often, he's remembered only as a supporting character in someone else's story, a footnote to Hunter S. Thompson's legend. Thompson himself immortalized him as Dr. Gonzo in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But the truth is more complicated. Without Oscar, that book might have never existed in the way we know it. He wasn't just a sidekick. He was the chaos, the fire, the challenge that pushed Hunter's prose into madness. But beyond Hunter's shadow, Oscar left his own work. The Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo and The Revolt of the Cockroach People. 2 books that remain raw, urgent testaments to Chicano identity, justice, and survival. His output was modest in size, cut short by his disappearance at just 39 years old. But it was powerful, it was personal, it was revolutionary. Today, his words still resonate. They remind us that the fight for dignity, equality, and recognition is not confined to the past. And they remind us that Oscar was not simply a caricature of excess, nor a lost wanderer swallowed by myth. He was a voice, a writer, a father, a man whose story deserved more than to end in silence. What really happened in Mazatlán remains a mystery. But perhaps the greater tragedy is not how he vanished, but how easily the world let him slip away. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod, and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/thelasttrippodcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.